welcome to the video. This one's about post-punk. What is post-punk and how did it evolve and rise and fall and rise again? That's a good question, isn't it? Well, I hope so, because if you're watching this, you'd better be interested, otherwise you're going to have a very boring few minutes. Let's get straight into it, shall we? And let's start with punk, because punk really started, well, the first final release by a punk band was by The Damned. It was New Rose.
Is she really going out with him?
That was in October 1976. And a lot of people, looking back, especially people that weren't there at the time or weren't that involved in it, think of the Sex Pistols as being the pinnacle of punk, which I don't think they really were. They were obviously quite important. They were an important band. They were a very musical band, thanks largely to Glenn Matlock, who was elbowed out. But they were quite a lot manufactured. Malcolm McLaren basically knew how to wind up the members of the band, especially Johnny Rotten, John Lydon, and let him loose on the media. And that's basically what happened. I mean, it was Malcolm McLaren deliberately being provocative. But I would say that at the time I was there with the punk thing. I was going to these clubs and watching the bands evolve, and there was a genuine punk feeling. There were bands like the Lurkers, Eater, the Crabs, and people we've forgotten now, the Spitfire Boys, and I can't remember most of them, but there were lots of bands that were, you know, the true spirit of punk. They were like people who didn't know how to play. They were working class blokes mainly, who basically went out and then decided to make music, even though they had no idea how to make music. But it was okay, because back then you could do what you wanted, and people did. It was very exciting. But of course, we're talking about post-punk. I'd like to say something like Susie and the Banshees, who played at the 100 Club Punk Festival, the famous one that it was like a media launch for punk, because punk was still going before then, obviously, and it was going after them. But that was the focus point, the focal point for punk. And Susie and the Banshees played that, and for what I can remember, I wasn't there. I won't be one of the 50,000 who claim to be one of the 300 who were actually there. From what I can recall, she didn't really do a proper band gig. I think she just recited something over a backing. Could you say that was punk, or was that post-punk already?
Answer me that.
Because the thing about post-punk is it came after punk. That's the main thing. It came after punk. It was influenced by punk, but it had other influences too. Because the punk thing was very, I don't know, very straight down the line. It was like a lot of the people who were involved in it, it was like anti-disco, anti-this, anti-soul, anti-blues. Even though it's very hard to be anti all these things when they have an influence on how you play. So when these bands started being post-punk and taking influences from things like disco and jazz and blues and avant-garde and all sorts of things like that, like Magazine were the most probably influential avant-garde band of the early post-punk, and then Wire. Which album was it that was the first post-punk album? A lot of people think it was the first Wire album or the second Wire album. Who knows? Maybe, but I think it was Magazine. Anyway, it doesn't really matter who was first, who was last. There were lots of bands like came out of it who used influencers who were more avant-garde. Because if you ever went down to the Vortex at Crackers, or indeed the Roxy Club, you would know that punk wasn't just 1, 2, 3, 4, blah, blah, blah. It was all types of things. So post-punk to me is very blurred. I found the post-punk thing much more exciting, much more rewarding, because it was like much less restrictive. It was open to ideas. And we had some great bands come out of the post-punk. But before we get there, can I just say, if you like this, please like, subscribe, you know what to do and all that stuff. It's good for everybody if you subscribe, by the way, and share it with your friends, and don't forget to comment, let me know what you think. Of course, we're talking about post-punk in the United Kingdom, because I don't know enough about the States, and to be honest with you, all the best stuff, as far as I can see, happened in the United Kingdom. And there's even an argument that the most famous post-punk band of all time, which was Television from the States, were they really post-punk? I mean, I don't know. Were they influenced by punk in the first place? I'm not sure that they were, to be honest with you. But that's in all the reference books, people talk about Television being the first one. Over here we had the ones I've already mentioned, Magazine and Wire, and there was Gang of Four, and there was Cure, there was Public Image Limited, led by Johnny Rotten, who's now become John Lydon. I'm not too sure he was the main creative force behind that. And there was the pop group, there were the Raincoats, and The Fall, amongst many others. All kinds of bands came out of post-punk, or were called post-punk. There was also the goth movement started at roughly the same time, and that was like an offshoot of post-punk in a way. And there were lots of offshoots as it went on and on, but the most famous British band, the most influential, I would say, of the post-punk was Joy Division, and their album Unknown Pleasures exemplified for many people what post-punk was all about. Obviously, Ian Curtis was troubled, and that sort of influenced in music and infiltrated everything that they did. And a lot of his performances, he wasn't necessarily on the spot at every gig. And the whole thing was it was just fast moving, it was going places. And eventually, one of the top bands, because Manchester, in a lot of the time, from the Beatles onwards, felt very left out of the British music scene. All right, there were Buzzcocks and Slaughterman Dogs and people like that, and John Cooper Clarke, and there's a lot of stuff happening in Manchester, but Liverpool obviously was the big influence in the 1960s with the Beatles and all those Liverpudlian bands, the Mersey Beat, and then London took over with the Rolling Stones and people like that, and all the British bands seemed to come from London or were based in London, because a lot of bands came from outside London. And Manchester really came into its own in the post-punk era, first with Joy Division, which morphed into New Order when Ian Curtis committed suicide, and then the Smiths, followed by that Oasis, which obviously weren't post-punk, even though they were after-punk. I suppose the Smiths were the pinnacle of the post-punk era, and then from then on it was downhill fast. But recently there's been a revival. I'm not sure it is a revival personally, because there's a school of thought that says that the White Stripes were a punk band, a later punk band, and that, well, it is true, their music is certainly very influenced by punk, and I'm not against it, you could say they were post-punk, couldn't you? Because obviously the White Stripes came along after the Sex Pistols and the Damned. So the theory goes that, and now there are bands which, again, I've come across them recently. There's a lot of good British bands. People say they're post-punk. I don't know. It's just a few of the more recent bands I'm really getting to enjoy, and they may be post-punk or may not be, but they're very good, I think. Include Sports Team, Squid, Black Country New Road, Dry Cleaning, Caught In, and Black Midi. There you go, there's some names there for you to check out. This is modern as well, fairly modern. Most of them started in the, 2016, 2017 time, but there's some good stuff there. Check it out.
Here's the thing.
You're worth as much as all the luxury you buy.
Here's the
The
thing.
world will be okay if we stop taking.
Are they post-punk? Well, let me know what you think, because I think now is a bit late to be post-punk, because everything now is post-punk, even though it might not be called that and might not have those influences. Well, thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed it, and if you did, please watch more of my videos and subscribe, don't forget, and like, etc. You might like this one next. Cheers!